Just 1 second, because I need to see on Instagram, which is a little bit slower than Facebook. Okay, 1 second. So, hello everybody. Welcome to our fifth conference about international science fiction. Tonight we have two guests, international guests, one from Mexico and the other one from the United States. And the topic will be translating Arabic science fiction and fantasy. You can watch all the old videos on our YouTube channel, and you can follow our conferences on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook page. So let's start with the first question, the kind of question we like to ask at Hikaya. If you were an Arabic word, which one would you be, Arturo?
Oh, I will cheat and ask Timothy to go first so I can get.
The first one that came to mind when I heard this question was the word istabada or istibad, which means to doubt. That's kind of the easy way, but because like you guys, I learned Arabic as a second language. You tend to learn words in funny ways in order to make them stick in your memory. And so for me, istibad was more about an extreme level of doubting. Like, I really don't think that's true. And I think it kind of applies when you're talking about doing the translation of fiction in general, but science fiction and fantasy, especially because the things that happen in these novels that we all enjoy reading and working on are so far-fetched. So this istibad has that sense of being at an extreme distance. So I'll just, that's what I thought of.
I would then say, so I don't speak Arabic. I worked on the Arabic to English to Spanish version. So my work had more to do with going back and forth and editing a little bit of the English version with one of the authors. But I would say a terminology that came through in the trilogies, etc., is being able to mend in between realities. That's something that goes across the books, the plane of the real world, the plane of the jinn, etc. So how to cross over and be a bridge across those worlds. I think that a lot of the books talk a lot about identity and transitioning through different, be it timelines or cultures, and the ability of the characters to adjust.
Yes.
And very tricky sometimes to translate, because it's not just a behavior, but it is a sort of the human quality over time. I'm sure we will discuss more through the chat this hour.
Yes. And as I'm part also of the conversation for once, my word will be inshallah. Because it's always with Arabic, when you know the Arab word, you never know what will happen. So people always say inshallah, it means if God wills. But it's also a way of life, I think, when I'm part Mediterranean. So it's a part of the culture of the Arab world, but also of Italy, of Spain, or I think South America as well, of not knowing what will happen next. And the Arabs brought it to another level. I mean, having like a religion, everything that happens in the future, it's unsure. So I like that as well, because it means that we cannot control what we have for the future.
And you remember in one of the trilogies, there is a phrase that is what begins with the book and ends with the future will be what it has already been.
Yes.
Phrase.
Can you explain to the public about the trilogy? So you both, and I work on that trilogy as well, by the way. So sure. I let you explain.
Go ahead, Timothy, because my translation faded from the English version, so we can forth. But you definitely had the stronger work to get to the English version and the communication with the authors on what they meant in certain situations in Arabic. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll start by introducing it because I don't think we've actually said. In Arabic, the trilogy is called Farsan wa Kahina, and it was written originally uh, by a Saudi author, Dr. Munir al-Kabani, and it is a combination to me of science fiction and fantasy because it's a alternate history with time travel and quantum mechanics all built into it. Lots of things that I really enjoy as a reader, so I was attracted to it from the get-go. So the main storyline starts out with what is probably our world,
Mm-hmm.
because dimensionality is a part of the story. It could be one that is just slightly askew from the one that we all live in, with a plastic surgeon who undergoes a shift and wakes up to a radio story that doesn't match his own memories. And then he runs into somebody that used to be close to and ends up getting thrown off a building and into the Middle Ages, the late 13th century, as Genghis Khan's invasion of his westward expansion is going on. He's about to move into the Arab world. There's all kinds of it's hard to know how much to say without giving away spoilers because I'm not a book reviewer. But the story involves Genghis Khan's granddaughter.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, if you are interested in having a teenager or younger read it, I think they're good books, except that you have to remember it begins with a rape scene. I forgot about that by the time I got to the end of it when I gave it to my teenage daughter to read. So be
Well,
warned
thankfully,
ahead of time.
young adults now are full of it as well. So I don't think it's. I mean, it
Mhm.
depends on the age of the teenager as well.
Yeah, and it's not extremely graphic, and the female victim ends up coming out on top. So
Yeah.
you know it has some redeeming qualities. I thought that the Arabic books were extremely well written. There's a very interesting combination of science fiction, fantasy. There's some Islamic theology that's discussed. There's a lot of very interesting material in there, and yeah, we end up finding out that there's world hopping going on. Several dimensions end up being collapsed in order for one character to increase his power,
Correct.
and I certainly personally recommend reading it. I don't get any commission from the sales, so I'm not saying that just so that I get more money.
I think that from a translation perspective, and I think we could go around, is very hard to do justice to the author and their intent across a trilogy in trying to first grasp where here and there is in
Hmm.
reality, in parallel realities, in
Yes.
parallel and across timelines. And this
Yes.
happens in the trilogy. You go through all three combinations
Yep.
of past, future, uh, this reality, the parallel reality, and the parallel universes. Uh,
Yes.
that was the most confusing thing for me. And I'm
Hmm.
sure revisions to the Spanish version.
For our viewers, the English version is called Warlocks and Warriors, right?
Yeah, Warriors and Warlocks, and the first book is Outcast, which is
Yes.
chapter one. Um, and the original title in Arabic is Forsan wa Kahina, which means knights and priests. And we had a nice discussion between the publisher, the author, and I about the title. The problem is that in the Western world, and I'm sure you guys both would agree with this, the idea of knights and priests immediately brings up the holy wars, the
Yes.
knights of the Catholic or the priests of the Catholic Church and knights in shining armor.
Yes.
And the actual knights and priests in the book, the knights are the Mongol horse-mounted warriors and a shaman who was a priest to Genghis Khan.
Yes. And what's
So I
the
felt like it was important to change that title in order to change the impression.
yes? we had something similar with the Italian version. So I worked on the Italian version for our readers. For now, we have the English version, the Spanish version. The Italian version will be out soon, I hope. And I do not know for the French version because I don't know the publishing house in Saudi Arabia if they have like a French publishing house producing the French version. So I cannot speak about that. I will fetch some information for our French readers. But for now, we have the English and the Spanish. And for the Italian version, we decided to have like the same kind of play. We didn't use warrior and warlocks or priest. We said swords and charms. Spade e sortilegi. Because it makes like the same ideas without using. We wanted to have the S at both the same letter at the beginning of the title, like in the English version.
Yeah, that was a big part of why I came up with what I did for the alliteration of it, so that it flowed. Yeah. And it turns out that there was, back in the 1970s, there was a book or two called Warriors and Warlocks that were like Dungeons and Dragons guidebooks, or something along, or some other tabletop RPG game that was called Warriors and Warlocks. But because Outcast and the other two chapters were technically part of the title, I didn't think we were going to run into any confusion.
Yes. And what's the title in Spanish?
We put guerreros y luchadores, so fighters and warriors. We wanted to stay slightly away from a militarized connotation. Connotation for, like you said, for the religious stuff. But we wanted to recognize the difference of people who would fight for their beliefs and would unwillingly become part of a larger conflict. And also those who would follow a leader into a battlefield. That would be more those groups. And a lot of the historical connotation of how they evolve is quite different. For the first one, the Warriors we did, you guys remember it was the first one was called, in English, was called Outcast, right?
Yes.
Yes, and we put it in Spanish, we call it Marginated. The rough translation.
That's good, yeah.
Yes, we had the same in Italian. We said reietto. It means the person who was rejected by all the other people.
Yes. So we had to signal more like an isolation, because a lot of the character development and storyline, of course, is the first book, so it gets outlined that way. To put it as an outcast, but also as the moment where the character stands up and builds that on their own, their hero journey of sorts. Yeah.
And the original version, it's Al-Gharib, which means actually the first meaning is the strange one. I mean the weird one, but it's not the real translation. So that brings me to another question. We have sometimes in Arabic words that mean something, but when we have a context, it changes exactly, like the title. Like Al-Gharib, it's the strange, but it means the strange to the tribe, so something, an outcast, as you translated the title. Do you have other examples of that came in mind to you, for example, in Arabic, Tim?
It happens so often that I can't think of an example right off the top of my head. So the title of the third book is Qareen. I actually used the transliteration of the Arabic word, but Qareen it's like a near twin, but there's a concept in folklore that it's almost an evil spirit who is a near self. Yes. And that was why they went with the title, because it was the main character's self from a different dimension.
Yes, it's like a doppelganger.
Yes, for us, in this, we kept the Arabic words for the second book on the trilogy, the Kutus,
Photos, yes.
and also the third one. But then I also did something, because there was a bit of a gap in time between we had the first book and the second. On the second, we made a slight change through the reading of the book when I'm going through history here on my shared drive as we speak. The first book, we said guerreros y luchadores, so with the warrior translation. But as the story develops, what I felt for the trilogy is that the first one, you have to slightly call them guerreros y luchadores. But as you progress towards the deep dive on the second book, which is a bit longer,
Just a bit. It's 2 times, I think.
to the truth
Extra 20,000 words or so.
Yeah,
sorts. So we set
so many nights.
the ones who analysis and the ones who follow the light of sorts.
Yeah.
And that
Mhm.
because it did not make sense to refer to the truthful and the ones who follow the dark side, in a sense, and the ones who follow the light, because the story had not been laid out yet. So
Mhm.
it would be a misnomer to call it properly on the first book, although you're introducing the story. But most of the big changes happen on the second one. Not to give it away, but there's an opportunity there's an opportunity as well. How do you call a trilogy something that you need to reframe slightly as you introduce more timeline and more parallel universe? You need to adjust how you introduce it, which is also an evolution of the book. I think that's important.
Yeah, and
Yes.
this is actually a question, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask the two of you.
Yes.
Do
Go
you
ahead.
read the whole book before you start? And in our cases, David, do you read the whole trilogy before you start? Or did you do like I did and read 1 or 2 chapters and go, this is great, and just get going? I
For
should
this
have read more
trilogy
deeply, I
or
feel like.
for the whole things?
Just as a practice in general, but this trilogy specifically.
This trilogy, no, because it was like they asked me to translate that, and I didn't have the time to read it all. So I started translating it while reading it, and it's a practice that I actually like sometimes because it gives me the same idea of. I try to translate the emotions I have, and then I come back to the translation after I finished. Like, I don't know, I give the first name, I don't know, Al Gharib, it was the strange one, the first translation. And then when I was at the end, I said, no, it's not the strange one. So I went back and translate everything. This
I
goes
had
with,
exactly the same thought, with that word too.
But for Hikaya, like I'm translating for my own publishing house, I have to decide if I want to invest my money on the book. So for those books for Hikaya, yes, I do translate. I do read all the books. But when it's another publisher asking me to translate, I usually go with the flow of the reading. What about you, Arturo?
When I started translating the first book of the trilogy, the third book had not been written entirely, so I did not have the luxury of seeing how things unfolded. What I liked to do was to read through, not speed reading because it was quite hard, and just start making, almost like if I was a private investigator or a detective, I start creating a bit of a wall with post-its of every character and their relationships. And the reason why that was useful, especially as you get to the second book, is because, not to give it away entirely, but there are some shapeshifter characters. You need to know when there's an impostor of one of your characters, and if you don't know the style in which each of the characters speaks and writes and conducts themselves, you have to be almost very faithful to how they would have their own dialogues, because you're not just translating all the dialogues in the same way. You have to give them personalities in the dialogues, and
Yes.
that's quite complex in the trilogy because you have 23 characters or so if you go through the 3 books. And
Yes, for our viewers, we
Sorry?
can compare that to Game of Thrones in an Arabic version. I mean, with a lot of characters talking and a lot of stories going on. It goes from Genghis Khan to the Assassin's Creed as well. So
Correct.
it's longer. Yes.
And added, like if you remember the movie Cloud Atlas, is the same. Like even the personalities change from one timeline to another. Like they may be more reserved 600 years before. They may be more liberal in the current iteration. And
Yes.
when, like for example, the ones that become self-aware that they can travel through time, they completely changed from being slightly timid to
Yes.
being more forceful and following the hero's journey. So you have to capture them being timid and then them being outgoing.
There's one thing also that is funny with the dialogues in Arabic. I think the English version and the Italian version and all the other versions will not have it, but it's the language we use in dialects between the now and the past.
Mhm.
For
Oh yeah, yeah.
yes, so for people that do not know Arabic, is a diglottic language. So we have like a spoken version and a written one. And what the the writer did, is that he used the dialect when he was talking in the present, but not when he was in the
Mhm.
past.
Yeah.
Mhm. And
And
I
he stuck with the more formal version of Arabic for the past,
Yes,
which is it's a common technique for like Arabic serials on television and movies. Also, if
yes.
a movie is made and set in a historic period, they almost always use either modern standard Arabic or as close to classical Arabic as they can get.
How did you make this difference in English, for example?
For me, it was I just tried to elevate the register slightly. It's
Mhm.
I don't think that the difference is enormous, but it's enough that I wanted it to be at least visible to someone who was paying close attention. And so I didn't immediately like try to shift back into Shakespearean English or something along those
Yeah.
lines. There is a novel that Yetachayalun has put out that would be the appropriate way to translate it, but I didn't feel like my Arabic was strong enough to tackle that side of it.
Yes. So for our viewers, يتخيلون, it's do you want to talk about يتخيلون, Tim, maybe? Just the project way better than
Sure.
me.
Yetachayalun is a Saudi publishing house with Yasser Bahjat is the public primary, I think, of the two. They have published Yasser and why is his name escaping me right now? Uh,
And Rami, no, Rami, it's
no,
uh,
his partner, Ibrahim
Ibrahim.
Abbas.
Ibrahim.
Yeah, so Yasser Bahjat and Ibrahim Abbas are both authors. They've both written, I think fantasy would be the best category for their novels, but it is a mix of science fiction is part of it too. But that's not that unusual for science fiction. That's why a lot of us just call it SF, because it's science fiction slash fantasy. Anyway,
Yes.
they are both authors who have written books, and their objective in writing is to have a specifically Arab character to their books and not have it be uh, Western style novels written in Arabic.
Mhm.
And if you go on YouTube and search for Yasser Bahjat, he's given several talks, including a TED talk about science fiction and its value to society, and how he thinks that the lack of science fiction and fantasy in certain languages, Arabic specifically, because that's the one that he's involved in, I I wouldn't say is holding the society back, but he uses the examples from French, English, and Japanese to say that the Western world and the Eastern world have advanced in ways that some parts of the Arab world have not. And he believes that use of the imagination, that looking forward and tackling problems in a fantastical way so that it feels outside the norm, but it gives you the ability to think about society's issues, is an important way that we as a human culture move forward. And their values really aligned with mine. And that was one of the big reasons why I was excited to start working with them when we did.
And I think one aspect of the role for us as translators is, and I mentioned this to Yasser at the time, also to the other authors like Montreal Kabani, was we can translate the the Middle East perspective on that sci-fi and fantasy world for a Western audience, but we still need to present it as their view. Like it's a window in something non-Western, and
Yes.
that is very tricky. It's not a monolith. That's what I want to get to. I think these translations evolve through community. And as we get fans that are dual language speakers and they spot themselves through their critical reading, they can themselves become part of that community that helps convey better the message to uphold that worldview and Arabic sci-fi, which I think is the whole purpose of the publishing, which is not just a product that gets put out. It's not a product. It's a living, breathing story. And I'll be the first one, or I struggled. I know it's there, and it's almost like thinking of electric cars or autonomous cars. I'm really hoping for the next software update to improve the output. And I think that's the opportunity that we have with our digital tools and communities, such as what we're doing right now, which is to say, don't judge the output that we have right now as the final way to tell the story. It's the first glance of how we can bring it into focus and make it thrive, because those intentions continue to evolve as well. So in words, get the printed version, get it autographed, but also get the Kindle version.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
So
and Yetta Khayaloun also has published quite a number of English novels that they're bringing into Arabic as well. But I think a big part of the reason why they're making that effort is to make the science fiction, well, and I'm sure they're also working with other languages than English, but part of what they're doing with that is to try to bring more science fiction more accessible into the Arab world, which will help spark the imagination and then hopefully spark more Arab authors to write in science fiction and fantasy.
Directly in Arabic, because most of people read in English. We had like the talk with Fadi Zarmout and Yasser. It's another Yasser. It's not the same one. Abul Hassab, and they were both telling us that they read in English, and so the imagination and the style of writing is directly English. I mean, not English, but English influenced by English. And the idea of reading directly in Arabic will lead to a way of seeing science fiction and fantasy and the future and the literary scene directly in English without passing through English.
So to give you to build on what you both are saying, in Mexico I'm in Guadalajara right now, and we have the International Book Fair at the end of November.
Yes.
Be the first time for any of the fans out there that the Ministry of Culture of Saudi Arabia brings a large delegation and a lot of publishers.
Oh, wow.
Yasser is coming here at the end of November.
Cool.
That's great.
Yes, it's very exciting because this is the cultural exchange component. So they are not parachuting and showing the books. We look for local printers to activate the local economy and say, as you are coming here, we are also generating jobs and strengthening the publishing industry. Because if we have a strong publishing industry, we can keep the costs down for local authors to be able to print their books and their novels, etc. One of the important things that's coming out is that we have said we aren't only just bringing our culture and our readers and our writers from the Arab world to Mexico, but here's the invitation, and this is what we're working on this week, and we're launching it formally next week. It's an open call for short stories from Mexican authors in Spanish or in their indigenous languages locally to compile those stories, curate them, and publish them in Arabic from the event that will happen at the end of November.
Well,
Oh,
that's really
that's
exciting.
amazing.
And I think that's the opportunity also for fans who like the stories and say, "Oh my God, I'm not gonna write 900 pages of could warriors and warlocks," or it's actually more than 900 to be honest. Yeah, like so we've said, do short stories, do something, express your creativity, express that indigenous knowledge, and that fantasy world that we don't know and we don't know how to hug. And we will look after you in the sense of doing that cultural exchange. And we're looking for people who can help us curate the content, like Guillermo del Toro, who is also from Guadalajara, and looking at those opportunities to bring those stories that we just don't parachute and try to sell books here. Is not a transaction, and that's what we're trying
Hmm.
to accomplish here. It's a glimpse into culture, and culture grows
Yeah.
as to cross pollinate. So we want to make sure we honor, in a sense, for Yasser to come here. We will host him. We'll be good hosts, but we also want an exchange. That is to say, okay, how are you taking all writers to your corner of the world?
Yes,
Hmm.
yes. And I think it's particularly interesting because you're so you speak Spanish, but it's a corner of the world which is not. I mean, it's Western. It's Western, but at the same time, it's an ex-colony as well. I mean, it's the South. It's a global South as well. So it's part of the same. Not the same word because it's not the same culture, but you have common ground. I mean, with the post-colonialist visions.
The threads of colonialism resonated a lot through the books for me, and you
Yes.
have to almost understand how to have this out of body experience, which fortunately many of the characters do throughout the books. Have to honor those as well.
Cool. Cool. And one question. So what brought you to Arabic specific? I think this is more for Tim, but Arturo, how did you also got to Arabic science fiction? I mean, it's a quite a particular one.
So my relationship to the publishing house, etc., was through Yasser. Uh,
Okay. Yes.
Knew him since 2011.
Yeah.
We were in two worlds. We were at Singularity University together. We lived together for 4 months, and this was at NASA Ames Research Park. So we did a lot of futurism side and that bridge building of trends and disruption, etc. And we also were part of the TEDx community. Him as a
Hmm.
one of the earliest translators that was for TED Talks, and
Yeah.
he also helped put together a lot of TEDx events in his region. So the two worlds connected, and I think that expresses that opportunity to reach out to like-minded people, different thoughts, making. I think one of the highlights from him as a person, as a leader, is the ability to have very strong, and you will probably remember this from conversations with him. He loves to debate, and he loves to be good friends with people that think exactly the opposite from him, and he gets
Hmm.
all drawn to making sure that he can have a good debate, that he would probably not sleep, literally not sleep. He's a night owl. Until a good discussion is had over arguments or positionings, and he does it in a very constructive way. He wants to be friends with somebody that thinks absolutely opposite to him, and at the end of the night, you just want to hug him and say, "Let me go to sleep. I trust you." uh,
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of why he was attracted to the science fiction and fantasy world, and it's probably something that I do too, because you want to be challenged.
Yeah.
mhm.
What all the way from H.G. Wells and some of the even earlier authors forward is is that they are challenging the way we think and the way we look at the world. And I certainly think that the trilogy we're talking about does that. But there are other Arabic novels that I've read or I've worked on pieces of that also challenge the world as it stands.
Yes,
Um,
I think for me on the challenging parts. I'm sorry to cut you up, but just building on that, it was very difficult to do justice by the evil characters on the novel, which I will absolutely not want to meet, but I have to be
mhm,
truthful, translating their dark worldview and enchantments on others to diminish them, or even, for example, there are sections of the book that are hard to translate in the world we live in, like all their misogynistic expressions, for example, of treatment of women, etc. You have to be truthful to the timeline, but also the book itself, you read through the whole trilogy, is not an expression or a promotion of those attitudes and actions, but it's concentrated pockets of behaviors that are, I would say, truthful to how those people would behave, and you have to capture them properly and almost put them in a bubble. Yeah.
Yep.
And you, Tim, how did you encounter Arabic? I mean, in the first time.
Well, when I was in high school, my family didn't have money necessary for me to go to college, so I joined the military. And when you join the military in the United States, one of the things they give you is they call it an aptitude test, a general aptitude test. Based on my score on that, they gave me a secondary aptitude test that was specifically a language aptitude test, and they sent me to language school.
Okay.
So I ended up going to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. That's where I learned Arabic the first time. I started studying Arabic in 1990, and I will absolutely say I have not yet stopped because I learn something new almost every time I pick up a document or a book to translate.
Yes.
But
You never stopped to learn.
I fell in love with it from the very beginning. It's one of the most fascinating things, and you both certainly know this, of being multilingual, or at least bilingual, is you really do see the world differently in your different languages.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that even as a kid, I always loved about fantasy and science fiction. Today, we call that world building, but in the 70s and 80s, when I was growing up and reading these books that I loved to read, I don't think that was the normal term for it, but you're creating an entire new world, whether it's J.R. Tolkien or David Eddings or whomever. You've got religions and worlds and gods and physical rules that are different from the ones that we live in. And to me, that's kind of the approach that I use when I'm translating from Arabic, in these novels particularly, but in the other ones that I've worked on also, or where I've done samples in small pieces, is yes, Islam is strange to most of the Western audience, and the concepts of Islam are odd and different and complicated for us to understand, but so are the magic rules in Game of Thrones or in the Lord of the Rings trilogy or whatever, Star Wars. It doesn't matter. You have to learn how that world works in order to fully appreciate the story. And the author doesn't hold your hand and drag you along, giving you little teeny tidbits and making it easy for you. You introduce the concept, you provide the terminology, and you let the reader decide if they want to go deeper into it. They can go and do more research. That's one of the advantages of translating from Arabic science fiction, is most of what's in there is either religious and is current belief of people, or it's folklore, and it's still something that you can research in current usage in English or Italian or French or Spanish or any of the other languages that we all work with.
Yes. And the funny part about that is that we always, learn something. There's always something to learn in translating, because sometimes it's, especially with Arabic, sometimes it's something very specific to a tiny bit of the Arabic word, and it doesn't exist somewhere else. Sometimes you get something from Palestine, and sometimes you get something from that village of Palestine as well that doesn't exist elsewhere, or a word that is used in that particular region, but not somewhere else.
I think that they're building on that is like in Warriors and Warlords. Remember the character at the very end that you realize is the most powerful one that almost no one interacted with.
Yes.
The one who played the instrument.
Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was a very revealing way of managing a character that controls the whole world, does not interfere. Probably twice there's like a pseudo this way is reality, but I saw that
Yes.
restraint in that character, and I think that's also interesting from a lore perspective, because the book focuses on all of these opportunities. What would have happened if instead of this boat not being destroyed, things happened this way, or this storm hadn't happened, and the colonization aspects of that. But there's this one entity that absolutely has all the power, and it leaves room for a future trilogy. I hope, just exploring characters.
Yeah, I would love to see the story continue. Yeah.
Right? Gives you like this hunch.
Yeah. Yeah, and he
Um,
plays teeny tiny roles in both of the first two books. He is
yes.
there, but yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
we were talking about the number of characters earlier. I keep, this is something I'd love to hear talking about doing post-it notes, Arturo, but
yeah.
I use Microsoft OneNote, and I have a page that's all of the characters. And then for the main characters, I have a page for each of the primary characters. I have a page for settings. I have pages for each of the main settings where people interact. I've got the original text. I've got my draft translated text and the final translated text. But anyway, I grabbed the list of all of the named characters who appeared more than once and threw it into a spreadsheet. There's about 130 of them. And there are many that only appeared once. So
Yes.
yeah, it's not a small scope series.
There are characters that change names depending on the timelines.
Mhm.
Or are the shapeshifters. I'll go back to that again.
It's something that is also very useful, because sometimes in Arabic, as it's not written with our characters, sometimes we have a name. For example, for Genghis Khan, we have a specific way of writing Genghis Khan, which is
Yes.
not the transliteration we use for other nouns, other names in the trilogy. So sometimes we have like it happens. We have like I remember when I was working on the second book, I realized after a while that I was spelling the same character in two different ways.
Mm.
It happens a lot because I mean it's not
Mhm.
written with our.
I
I mean,
never happens on pass. I probably read through the whole book 10 or 12 times, and just
Mhm.
or that we didn't omit a character or misrepresent. For example, even how you translate characters having dreams with other characters, that's also quite important, because you have to remember that one character dreamt of an event, which then you have to remember that the character in that dream does not know that that happened, because that was a dream of someone else.
Mhm.
yes,
Or,
yes,
Or that the dream itself was an alternate reality. Yeah.
yes.
or
Also,
That's where
the
that
trilogy
dream
is
is more of a vision or a memory.
and
yeah,
that if later in the plot they meet, you have to remember that they may not have known that, because that never
Mhm.
happened. You have to keep that tension of the story. Yes, very complex.
yes.
Yep.
One question: what do you think are the characteristics of translating Arabic novels in your languages, so English and Spanish and Italian and French for me, and specifically Arabic fantasy and science fiction? Are there like do you think that Arabic is translated in a different way than French, or, for example, English into Spanish, or French into English? Are there like difficulties that are specific to Arabic?
Um,
I have one. I have one. If I can start, it's
Please do.
time. It's the time, because Arabic doesn't use the time as English, as European languages. So sometimes you have the past and the present mixed up in the same sentence sometimes.
Mhm.
It depends on the author. But I have like two authors. They use the past, the present, but you feel the action is in the past. But when they describe, they use the present, because the present in Arabic, for our viewers that do not speak Arabic, the present is not a present. It's a generic action. And especially for French, when I'm translating into French, French is a very strict language with time timelines. So we have
Mhm.
like to use the past if the action is in the past.
Yes, you have to bottle it almost.
Yes, and in Arabic it's not necessary. So sometimes you start translating a sentence and you think it's in the present, and then it's in the past. I don't know if it happens to you in English as well, for example.
I don't think I felt that as much. I mean, maybe it's because I've been translating not novels specifically, but I've been translating in general for 25 years now.
Yeah,
And I think that in some ways the tenses come a little bit more organically as I work.
yeah,
But when you're dealing with novels, I mean, even in English, some authors will write in a present continuous,
yeah,
which is, but I think you're right. I think that in Arabic, there's a tendency to slip between the present continuous and the past. And as a translator, I think in the English book, it's been a long time since I've read my own work, but I'm pretty sure I said everything I wrote the books as a past tense
yes, yes,
story. I didn't switch tenses back and forth between present continuous. Although now that I think about it, it could have been an interesting way to approach the project. It made it harder for Arturo.
I think in some sense with the romantic languages, location is also tricky, like here and there. Remember those?
Mhm.
Very tricky because
Tricky
here,
enough that one of Yasser's, or no, Ibrahim's, one of his books is called Hunak, which is there. So
yes,
yes,
that was very difficult to translate. Like the first time I read it, my God, I was like here, there, but also there could be there in the real world or there
Mhm.
in world.
In that second dimension of the alternate reality, yeah.
So it's like you have 6 locations because it's like almost this quantum approach to linguistic writing.
Hmm.
For the translation, that was very tricky. One of the things, so not so much because you've expanded quite a bit on the temporal aspect of language. One of the things that we did in the Spanish ones, which is slightly academic in the approach, but I didn't know how to create a dictionary for the reader who is not familiar with Arabic terms, artifacts, religious rituals, etc. We had to
Hmm.
do footnotes, and we would
Hmm.
explain what, for example, if there was a specific dagger that was used in a battle, what's the name of the dagger, what it's made of, when was it made, if it was relevant, or a specific ritual, a religious ritual, or if there's a practice in a specific region, etc. A lot of footnotes because it didn't make sense to translate the word in line with the text. It would break the
Hmm.
paragraph. So we had a lot of footnotes uh, for quick explanations, and we also kept at the end an appendix of larger explanations for
Hmm.
terminology and the characters and who is what and where, etc.
so it's not only a novel; it's also a door to the Arabic word somehow.
Hmm.
Yeah, you have to explain the culture a lot because, for example, we have been over 500 years removed from the original cultures of the indigenous groups here. Very few people would still speak the original language, and yeah, that colonization process comes through every moment you're translating because you have to translate to the colonized about other terms, and you
Yeah.
realize how ingrained our culture is through that process.
What about you, Tim?
I I primarily use the technique we called stealth. It's called stealth glossing, I think is the best way to describe it. So where I would use the original term and then provide something instead of just translating directly from the Arabic, I would use the original term and then add a 2 or 3 word explanation to it. And then after that point, I would just use the Arabic term. And in the first book, I did there is a glossary in the first book in the English
Mm-hmm.
edition, but we did not do glossaries in the second or third book because all of the primary Islamic concepts were introduced in the first book. I don't think there was anything really different that was added in books 2 and book 3. But as an example of stealth gloss, I might say he looked up into the sky and saw that the sun was setting, so he arranged the Maghrib prayer in English instead of just saying where in the Arabic it just said they prayed Maghrib and left it at that.
Mm.
Yes,
So
yes.
there was a few places where I added small bits like that to make it so that you don't have to stop and look at the glossary to have a good idea of what's going on. And this ties back to what I was saying about world building.
Yes, it happens a lot in fantasy, by the way. I mean, in Tolkien, you have sometimes with the elves. I don't know. They talk about Lothlorien, the house of the elves, and then after that, you know that Lothlorien is the house of the elves, for example.
And I tried not to do any info dumping like you would. I mean, somebody who's truly doing world building will usually arrange a scene where there's two characters talking to each other, one who doesn't know and one who does, and they explain it. And as the term of art, that's info dumping. Happens on television programs too. I tried to avoid doing something like that. I didn't want to insert a scene of explanation, but it's a handy tool to use if you've got the chance.
Yes,
but I think that trying to keep it small and just introducing those concepts. And the other thing is, we talked about spelling Arabic terms in English. I tried to use, for the religious terms, I tried to use English spellings that are the most prevalent on the internet. It was easiest for me to go using that English spelling to find that concept on Wikipedia or whatever. So somebody could go look it up if they were interested enough.
Correct. I have two comments on that, on lifting the original Arabic. In the Spanish translations, every time the Quran was quoted, we actually did a split page of the Arabic version written on the translation in Arabic, and then Spanish version, just because
that would have been lovely, yeah.
And we sort of kept that as if it was the original Arabic book. And then it was almost like side by side of what they would have experienced from a perspective of artifacts as you were doing the world building in the back of your head. And some phrases as well. So that's the second comment I have. And you reminded me with the sunrise comment. There are some phrases that are not good omens, but especially when things were turning sour in some of the situations. When they said there was you remember this phrase, did the sun rise on the west or what happened? And that was a very translation, which if you miss it, you just translate, did the sun rise in the west? But you have to explain that that's a phrase used to talk about dark times when, the sunrise is happening where sunset should happen.
Yes.
Omen. So if you don't have a conversations with people who speak the language and explain to you some of those phrases, you are not necessarily hurting the plot too much, but you've missed a slight hunch of how they will perceive a situation later.
Yes. The difficult thing is when you have a cultural thing that give you a hinge of or a connotation that you have to maintain on different levels. So the what's happening, but also what will happen, and then the feeling that the readers have to feel. So that's the most difficult thing when you always lose something, I think. But what's fun is that sometimes we can gain the same thing somewhere else. I don't know if you do that. Like there are wordplays you cannot use, but sometimes you find a spot when you say, oh, if he wrote in English or in Spanish or in Italian or in French, he would have said that in that precise spot. That's in French we call it compensation. We compensate the loss of something with gaining the same style but somewhere else.
Yeah.
Do you do that?
Yeah, if one character is prone to wordplay, that kind of a thing, and then you may not be able to fit the wordplay into translating a certain phrase, but there's a phrase he uses later that's not wordplay in Arabic, but you can use the wordplay in Italian, French, English, Spanish. Yeah. I think I did do that a couple of times. Yes.
Yes.
I can't
I
think of any specific examples. It's been a while since we did these translations.
I did the compensating, for example, on the cultural aspects of explaining how the daily lives of women of the time, because on the book, for example, it would say how specific a woman or the daughter were treated or they behaved in that household, but it would be a behavior that was common at the time across that gender relationship. And I had to almost expand to say this is normal in this context.
Mm-hmm.
Don't take a misogynistic view of how,
Yes.
because you have to compensate for the story, not to justify it in any other woke sense or anything like that, but you all have to keep that aspect of how things were, and you have to be truthful.
Mm-hmm.
So there was some compensating in expanding for the reader to say, like in other houses, or like you have like 2 or 3 words that say like
Yeah.
it's normal.
And what's the reception of generally non-Western sci-fi and fantasy works in the United States and in Mexico, and especially Arabic, but not only? I mean, I think now we have the huge success of Three-Body Problem,
Mm-hmm.
and especially of Korean science fiction, especially on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there is a gain in that people are more interested in non-Western or non-Anglo-American, because it's mostly more Anglo-American science fiction and fantasy, or it's still marginal?
I think it is still marginal to an extent, but I think that things like the Three-Body Problem are opening a door, and the various television programming, streaming services, especially since some of those things hit during the COVID lockdowns and people had nothing better to do with their time but watch streaming television shows. And I
Yes,
think that it created an opportunity for people to look at something that's beyond what they would normally go and see or watch on their own. But since you're at home now all day long with nothing else to do, why not give it a shot? I I'd like to give a lot of credit to Ken Liu, who's the translator of the first book of the Three-Body Problem trilogy. He translated book 1 and book 3, and I think there's a book 4 now of the trilogy, which sometimes happens, that he also translated. And I would advise anybody who's interested in translation to read Ken Liu's translator's note to the first book of the Three-Body Problem. It's about a 10-page discussion of his translation methodology. But as far as Arabic specifically goes, I've had some people who have read my translation of these books and have given us some very positive feedback and seem to be very interested in it. But I don't think we've hit anywhere near the market share that we could. The challenge, of course, is always going to be money and trying to advertise and how to reach that audience.
yes,
It being Kindle books, and with the Hikaya folks occasionally, especially during like conferences and things like that, they'll offer the books for free download. I think that sort of action helps, and they're very active in attending conferences around the world, and I think that certainly helps. And bringing us in, I think, is also a good idea to bring the translators along, and that happens a lot with translated literature in general, where the translators have to be involved in the marketing.
yes,
Yeah,
But I think with the concept of world building in science fiction and fantasy means that I think people, the readership that would enjoy these books, are at least theoretically open to the idea of experiencing these new worlds. It's just a matter of how do we get these worlds to where they are so they can experience them.
from the end, there's an opportunity and a quest for freshness of new characters and new lores.
Mhm.
I have been on a cycle, be it the Marvel universe or DC Comics, that these were stories that were written 50 years ago or more, and they're just being rehashed, redone, re-explored. And this genuinely gives the pathway to explore completely different approaches, completely different beliefs and value systems. And the translator acts as that bridge. And I think another conversation we could have we've been going for an hour, is we have the translation, but many times we need to ask the publisher, in this case, the world, etc., is who is the audience that is going to read it? And if you tell me it's a middle-aged professional, etc., they can pay for their books, or if you tell me it's teenagers whose parents will buy books for them, you have to have a editor after your translation to make sure that the wording is appealing. And I would say for the translation and the localization process, having a style editor helps a lot to make sure that the author's intent for the audience is true, and that you are using the right vocabulary for that Gen Z, either late millennial or Gen Z or alphas as we're coming through. There's teenager alpha. That is also a massive conversation we could have later on about how do we make sure that the style of writing appeals to that generation, which is separate from the translation. Like the translation is almost like this column of truth of sorts, but then you really have to angle it for a specific generation of readers.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That also can make
there's meaning, and then there's composition. Yeah.
And sometimes it happens that you start translating, and you have like a register, and then you talk to the editor or the publisher, and they tell you, it might be too adult. You have to adapt a little bit for younger readers, or the opposite happens as well. So it's a little bit too young adult, and you have to make it a little bit more adult. Mm-hmm. And there's something really weird that happened. I talked to a translator from English into French, and they told me that sometimes they adapt the novels for a different audience between the countries. So sometimes it's a young adult it's an adult book in English, but it becomes a young adult in French because they target more young adult readers. So I think it's an interesting topic because it changes the vision of the book itself,
right,
but it reminds us as well that it's a market.
Yes. To give you an example, or books in Spanish were translated by me, which I'm a millennial, so born in the early 80s, and then the style editor is a Gen Xer who was also a Spanish language teacher in high school. So older generation, but interacting with teenagers, specifically in language teaching and competition, etc. So that was very valuable. Like I would remember, and the translations, and they would come back, and probably 10% didn't have a word change or the flow of sentences. And they would tell me, you are writing for a TikTok generation who doesn't have a span of attention. Like you have to be writing in a different way, the interactions and the message, etc.
Yes. When I translated the first two books of the trilogy, my idea was I was wondering who will read it. I mean, it will be mostly, people between 15 and 25 years old that like fantasy and science fiction, because older generations usually do not. They do read science fiction, but the general audience now are the post millennials. So we had like to tone down sometimes my first version because it was too high compared to what readers are used to.
Yeah, and there were pieces of it where you could not really tone down that literature, because Dr. Al-Kabani obviously has an incredible repertoire of Arabic literature at his fingertips and in his mind. With all of the Sufi poetry, especially, I found extremely challenging to translate. I'd never worked on anything of that nature before, and the language was absolutely beautiful. But if you were to take that register down too low, it would no longer be what it is.
And that's why for us we kept it in Arabic, or like if there was a text that was too elaborate to that, like we would just say, and he read, and then you would have the like almost a window into what he was reading, and then you would zoom out to the translation.
Yeah,
uh,
that is a you when you mentioned that earlier, that's a lovely concept. I think it would have been really interesting to have the Arabic text in parallel, especially for the poetry and the Quran
Yeah,
and Hadith quotations,
just
because
version.
they are pieces of global literature, and I think it would be great to
yeah.
share them in that
Yes,
format.
for
In the Italian version, I remember there's this prophecy slash poem slash and slash I mean song that it's really beautiful in Arabic, and I remember like counting the syllables to have like
Hmm.
I try to not just translate the meaning but also the form, because it's a song, it's a poem. And
Hmm.
yes, and that for example, I had to not to lower the style, but to higher, I mean to go higher, and to go to a more poetic, like not medieval, but I mean older kind of Italian, I remember, and that was
Hmm.
really challenging as well. But I think that people are more prone to read like a small text in poem, that is harder, but if the action flows smoothly after that, if the whole book is too difficult to read, I don't know, what do you think?
I think we live with like the generation of, for the readers, they will either be the TikTok 5 seconds, or they would go down a rabbit hole of 3 hours on a post. It's sort of so
Yes.
both exist.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I would say that, speaking of the TikTok generation, book talk has become such a thing where people go into very deep
Yes.
analysis of books on TikTok, that
Mm.
I think you have a little bit of both, where it's people that are just skimming through books or reading them very quickly in order to be able to say, I read 130 books in the past year, or whatever it
Yes.
is they want to do.
Think
But then there are also people who will hold up a paper copy of the book where it's all full of little tabs and annotations and highlights, and they'll spend 3 hours analyzing a paragraph. Like,
yeah,
Yes.
it's fascinating.
like a full
Yeah.
describing the medieval
Hmm.
church process. Those were long.
Yeah.
And what are the steps you
Good.
take for
Well, I think we
translating a
have
novel?
more
Yeah.
to explore into next sessions. Uh,
Yes.
Definitely a lot of food for thought here.
Yes. So I will skip some questions because it's already 8:10 here. I don't know, but I mean it's been 1 hour and 10 minutes, and usually we do maximum 1 hour and 15, 1 hour and 20 minutes. Can you tell us one thing you find funny or interesting that happened to you while translating a novel, about the text itself or the context? And while you
I
think,
think I'm going to go. I think I'm going to go back to especially the very long poem that was at the end of book 3.
Mm.
yes,
When I was translating that one, I I I know you've read my translation, Arturo, but I
Yes.
don't know if David has. I I
that's the
actually
third one.
translated it following a pentameter style rhythm in
Yeah,
English, and it just started to happen after about the third or fourth line as I was translating, and then I decided I would try to stick to it. And before that, the other poems that I translated more into a free verse style, just because I'm not I wouldn't call myself a poet by any stretch of the imagination. So I was more concerned with trying to bring across the meaning and as much of the beauty of that language as I could. But with that one in particular, it was so musical in the source that it just started to happen, and then I began intentionally doing it to make sure that it flowed the same way through the entire poem.
yes, yes. So you use a kind of verse. I mean, you decided for the last one to stick to a to the Oh, sorry, I lost
It's
the
a
word.
rhythm. Yeah, it's the pentameter where it's da 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 as you go, where the emphasis hits every other syllable.
Yes,
So
yes.
it has, it's not iambic like Shakespeare, but it has a little bit of that feel to it when you read it aloud in English.
And did you use rhymes as well?
Yeah, every other
Right.
line. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Arturo,
Yeah,
how did you
I went a
manage?
little crazy with that one.
Okay,
I,
you told yourself, well, I will, I mean, have fun with this one.
for my experience was because I understood what Tim did in translating it. I just tried to follow the rhythm. But I did keep, in some instances, the Arabic version, just to remind people, there is a higher order to the translation.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think from a process perspective, you immerse yourself in the books. Like when I
Yes.
was reading, I would remember that, or start thinking of certain scenes of the book, and be more open-minded in my dreams.
Yes.
I don't know if it happened to you, but sometimes I would have dreams that crossed over with some of the books that I during the process on the weeks of translating them.
Yeah, when you get so deeply immersed in anything, I think it happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
especially in related situations. Yeah.
I will ask the viewers if they have any question, by the way. I see that we have people connected. If you want to ask any questions to us about the translation and how we translate books, fantasy books from Arabic, do not hesitate. But I don't think people usually do not ask a lot of questions. They do ask questions after they come and ask questions by message.
We cannot reply on the comments after the video gets posted.
Yes. Is there something you want to say to Western readers about science fiction, Arabic science fiction?
Keep your mind open. I mean,
Yes.
that's what sci-fi and fantasy is all about. And I really think that there is a lot to add from other cultures, whether it's Arabic specifically, because that's my field, but I think that I've definitely read some uh, Central American science fiction and literature and Eastern Chinese, Korean. There are amazing translators in all of those places that do awesome work, and the books are worth reading. And especially to experience a more extremely different worldview, one that goes beyond the hero's journey that most Western sci-fi and fantasy follows.
Yes.
Yes.
I would say there's not only one cookie jar. To paraphrase what Tim just said, there's more than one cookie jar. There's more things than cookies, and I think one of the most interesting tools of soft power that could exist in making sure a culture gets known around the world is not just that it's made by military or force, but soft power and strong diplomacy is also spreading culture. And I
Yeah.
think
Mhm.
being able to have strong networks of translators, style editors, good compensators, as we discussed, that opens
So
up.
we can make a living doing this job. Yes, that would
Yeah,
be
Yes,
nice.
that will be amazing.
I think that that curiosity for others, and
Mhm.
that's not to say we're gatekeepers, but that lies the responsibility to seek out and support those translations and to immerse in the culture and gain a sense of what their intent is and opportunity. So to be open-minded is also to lean forward. And I think because most of these works were done before and during the pandemic, and how our workflows change with that process, I think it's also an opportunity for the future for digital workflows to continue the same way we're having this conversation in 3 different countries with audiences in
Mhm.
other as well. So the practice of translating, localizing, etc., is something that is novel, and it doesn't mean that you're just a sci-fi geek, but your tools and skill set, like in the case of Tim, can be used for other ways professionally, and you can continue to have not only a day job, but a fractional, like our generation now has this fractional job structures, etc. We don't just do one. I think that's an expression of how our culture is changing, set aside from a whole other conversation we can have on AI tools and that interpretation of texts and etc.
Yes, yes. And are there any questions you would like to ask each other's? I mean, I put my questions, but if you have any you want to ask us before leaving, if you have any curiosity about, I don't know, the market, the reception in the South America or in Europe, or if you have anything to ask us, I ask you to.
Would you what do you think of the, like I mentioned, for me it's a living process to translate and edit a piece, but that what I wanted to ask is, would you redo or revisit a previous piece of work you did as you continue immersing in a language and a culture? Is that an urge you would have, like to not to redo but to revamp, or would you say no, we move on and we make the better one, like a new one better, a new author, a new book better with the tools that you've learned?
That's an interesting conundrum. So the first novel, when I translated in English, we did not have an editor. Dr. Al-Kabani read it himself. Of course, he has very good English, and gave me some wonderful feedback. He had the ability to notice places that were off, and spot things. And I had a couple of what we call beta readers, which were basically friends of mine who were sci-fi fantasy fans, and they read as I was drafting and would also give some feedback. With book 2 and book 3, we engaged editors, but they were primarily just line editors, looking for grammar, punctuation, style, and continuity. So making sure that the same character was spelled the same way all the way through the book, which is why they had access to my OneNote file so that they could see the ground truth, whatever the primary version of it was that I wanted. I would not mind at all. I would be perfectly happy to spend 4 weeks or 5 weeks, not necessarily retranslating book 1, but revisiting it and looking for the same kind of continuity things that those editors picked up in books 2 and 3, but also possibly cleaning a few concepts up, because I had not yet read book 2 and book 3 when I translated book 1. Yes. So it would be fun. But on the other hand, I would also really enjoy translating something new. I haven't read all of Dr. Mulder's other books, but I bet that they would be fun to tackle also.
How about you?
To me, it's a little bit different because as I translate in 2 languages, sometimes happens that I have to translate the same book in 2 languages. So for now, it's not a sci-fi book, but I have this book I translated into Italian, and have a French publishing house who asked me to translate it into French. Yes. So sometimes I go back to the Italian version to see what I did for the Italian version, and I tell myself, oh my God, this is not what I meant. Or I find like it's not very huge mistakes. They're not mistakes, they're like choices that I wouldn't do in French for different reasons, or I would have like different opinion on the French, because also, I don't know, my brain is split in 2. So sometimes I translate from Arabic into Italian and it goes on that way. And when I do to French, I don't know why it takes another way of saying the same thing, because I mean, languages.
For me, I'll just add to it briefly to say, I am at peace knowing that in 2 weeks, for example, we are printing 500 copies of each in Spanish.
Yes.
And there's the skeletons in the closet in those books that will come back to haunt me, but I'm at peace because through the feedback of the community, they will be made better. And I think and I wouldn't necessarily get stuck into a loop of perfection, because then we would never get to translate other stories. But before revisiting, for example, Warriors and Warlocks, I would really like to write together with you guys a travel guide book to all those countries to the east,
Mhm.
and eat bread in Samarkand, and to eat all of these things that the characters do, to have a better immersion and take out in the air, so to say, as a translator, because then I can better
Yes.
spatial placement of the story.
Yes.
And I think especially since that particular conflict between the Mongol and the Islamic world, I won't even say the Muslim world, because so much of that part of the world at that time was more Persianate than it was Arab. I That's not really taught in Western
No,
history.
no.
No, no,
I didn't
no.
learn about that in high school or college, and my bachelor's degree is in Middle Eastern history, and I was only barely aware. So I'm certain that all three of us probably did a lot of deep reading as we did this translation job, and
I,
and learning much more about that part of history.
I told yesterday, we need to have this extra online goodies of maps, like superimposed maps of the locations, the books, and
Mhm.
traveling.
Yes.
Fans on the stories, kind of like people go to New Zealand to play Hobbit. Uh, but I think there's an opportunity for that extension again on the soft power and leaning in a hand and opening a hand for people to see the culture, which is what you ultimately want to do, which is not just to read the book, but okay, do the sci-fi version of Eat, Pray, Love, and immerse yourself in some of these locations.
Yeah, I thought about, this is one of those conundrums of being a translator. Right? We are compensated for the words we're translating, but we're not compensated for any of the extra effort that we put into the research or advertising or anything else. I thought at the time it would be very interesting. You guys are probably familiar with the Fandom website, where
Yes.
people create a wiki style uh, deep history and analysis of different properties, whether it's Marvel or Brandon Sanderson's multiverse, or whatever, the Cosmere from Brandon Sanderson. I thought it would be very interesting to set up a fandom page that covered this trilogy,
Yes.
where it links not only the characters that are in the book, but also talks about the real history that's involved in the book. And this is one of the things that I find really fascinating about doing history as fantasy.
Yes,
Yes.
I think in that process, if we collaborated in defining it from, because we didn't work together in the translations, I think there's a strong value in going like, oh, I didn't think of it that way, and I didn't think of it that way.
Yes. And I think that working together, it happens in some projects. It also gives sometimes, even if we do all the researches we can, sometimes we have like an information in I don't know, in German, and I don't speak German, so I cannot find it. Or you can find it in that particular library, but I don't live, I don't know, in America, so I cannot find it because I have like my French or my Italian library here. So sometimes we have information that misses because of, I mean,
I think like
external.
for me, like wrapping up a little bit of my thinking, translations are not periscopes; they
Yeah.
are telescopes, and every time you touch it, you're gonna get a very different view on the kaleidoscope,
Yeah.
even if
Yes.
you're doing it again.
Mhm.
Yes. 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 Cool. 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 Um, I see no questions. I don't know if my at the technical part they have questions for me. I'm just looking. No, there are no questions. Thank you for having been with me today. It was really interesting, and you will able to find the videos on our YouTube channel. Next conference will be in 2 weeks, and it will be about not the Middle East for once, because it has been a little bit a lot about Middle East, because of course, it's my area of expertise. It will be about Greece. So it will be about Greece science fiction and fantasy. So it's always in the same area, but it's got its own flavor. And we will publish all the infos on our Instagram, Facebook pages. So thank you, the viewers, for having watched all the videos, and see you in 2 weeks.